So one of the things I want to start off discussing, one of the common misconceptions I think we have about looking at Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament is we view them as kind of like peaks of the iceberg, where we see a few points, Isaiah 53, some of these big passages, and we neglect what Christ and the New Testament testifies, that the whole Old Testament as itself is a Messianic document pointing to Christ. It's not just these little peaks on the iceberg. We might see these certain points that we see more because they're more clear in terms of the development of prophecies pointing to Christ, but the whole Old Testament itself as a unified whole is pointing to Christ. And so what I want to do today is not just look at this systematically, but kind of in the first part of this is just show how with that beginning promise in Genesis 3:15, how that develops with the other prophecies, so that way we don't just see these prophecies as isolated events, but we see how they build on each other, and that we have a greater appreciation for how the Old Testament, how the later prophets are building on what Moses said in the Pentateuch, for example, and how these prophecies build on each other, and how understanding that helps us to have a more fuller and complete sense of Christ's work rather than viewing them just as isolated different prophecies. And what that is technically called is biblical theology, where as systematic theology, we'll separate things by a category. We'll look at soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, so we'll get a bunch of scriptures, we'll put them together by that category, and then we'll study it. Whereas biblical theology is you develop it as it goes with revelation. So we start at the beginning, so that's why we're going to start at Genesis 3:15 and with that prophecy, and then progress further rather than going immediately to, say, Isaiah 53 or some of the big prophecies, so that we can see that development from, basically an analogy would be from a seed form to the tree that comes forth from that, so we have a greater appreciation for that. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do today. One other point that I want to make clear is that we often think of Messianic prophecies as pertaining primarily to evangelism, to people that are Jewish in background, but I think we also need to acknowledge that, for example, in our last lesson on Islam, I pointed out that they acknowledge, according to the Quran, where it denies the crucifixion, they would say Jesus is the Messiah, and yet they would only say he was a prophet, which shows that Muslims don't really have a consistent understanding of the prior revelation. So the information I'm giving is just as important for a Muslim who's going to deny the crucifixion. For example, with Psalm 22 we're going to be going over, some of these prophecies are just as relevant for witnessing to a Muslim as somebody who's Jewish or somebody who's a Jehovah's Witness, because obviously we have to understand that our doctrine of Christ doesn't just start in the New Testament, but it develops from the Old into the New. So by having a broader scope and seeing that development, it helps us to be more equipped in understanding what is the doctrine of Christ, who is the person of Christ, so that when we're witnessing to somebody, whether it's a Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Jewish, Muslim, that we know what the Bible teaches about the person of Christ, and that way we're well prepared to respond to objections from a variety of worldviews that we encounter. And I want to quote from a theologian, Gerhardus Voss, just kind of explaining what I mentioned with the tree analogy and how this is important for understanding how we study theology and viewing it more as a development with the Bible as we see from Genesis to Revelation, rather than systematically and viewing it more in a logical manner, whereas we can also study it in terms of its progression. He says, the organic process is from seed form to the attainment of full growth, yet we do not say that in the qualitative sense the seed is less perfect than the tree. The feature in question explains further how the salvific sufficiency of the truth could belong to it in its first state of emergence. In the seed form, the minimum of indispensable knowledge was already present. Again, it explains how revelation could be so closely determined in its onward movement by the onward movement of redemption. But redemption, as it is well known, is eminently organic in its process. It does not proceed with uniform motion, but is rather epical in its onward state. So what he's saying is basically it's not just like a straight line going up as we see the development, but there's more peaks and valleys at certain points, like I'm saying. But we see an overall development, but it's not just a straight line. There's certain high points and valleys that we'll see as we study the Bible and seeing the development of redemptive history, of those prophecies pointing to Christ in the Old Testament. And what I also have here on the board on the side there by the door is I have a few of some of the basic terms in terms of what are some of the basic definitions that we need to know, regardless of whether you know Greek or Hebrew, and just understanding some of the key terms and studying these messianic prophecies, whether it's you're talking to somebody who's Jewish or whether you're researching this more because you want to understand better the prophecies in the Old Testament. Here are some terms that you may come across in a book that deals with that or a commentary. So the first term that I want to point to is the term on the bottom called the Masoretic text. That refers to the Hebrew Old Testament, and specifically the Masoretes were Jewish scribes, and during the time period I have there, about 600 to 750 AD, what they did is because the Hebrew language was primarily transmitted orally by tradition, so they would teach their children the Hebrew Bible, they would memorize it, be able to verbally recite it, but at that point basically they would have written it without any vowel points because they already had it memorized, it was already spoken orally. But at that point what the Masoretes did in order to preserve the Hebrew Old Testament was they added the vowel points to the text, and that's what we have today, whether you're studying Hebrew here with Dr. Chow, whether you're studying at TMS or another seminary, we use the Hebrew Bible with the vowel points, which is called the Masoretic text. So that's basically the base text, the Hebrew Old Testament. And then another translation we have of that that's significant is what's called the Septuagint, or the LXX for an abbreviation. And what that is it is a Greek translation of the Old Testament before the time of Christ. I have there from about 200 to 400 BC. And the reason that was necessary is because after exile, after Israel was taken out of Babylon, some of the people had forgotten the Hebrew language, and some of them living in the Greco-Roman Empire would have known Greek better than Hebrew, so there became a necessity to translate the Old Testament into Greek so they would be able to learn it and read it. So this is a Jewish translation of the Old Testament prior to the time of Christ. And another similar situation is with the one I have listed on the top of the board called a Targum, which is an Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. And basically that was a similar situation with the Greek, whereas when people were taken into Babylon in captivity, even Daniel wrote some of the book of Daniel in Aramaic and Ezra, so some parts of the Old Testament are written in that language. But some of the people who were taken into captivity, since that was a native language, after a few generations, their children would have forgotten naturally to speak Hebrew, so they would have known Aramaic, which is a very similar language. So there became also a need to translate the Old Testament into that language. So you have what are called the Aramaic Targums, which are Jewish translations of the Old Testament into Aramaic, which is basically like a sister language to Hebrew. It's very similar in a lot of ways. And then another brief point I want to make is something that relates to one of the prophecies I'm going to be going over with Genesis 49:10. This deals with how a little bit of textual criticism and how we compare the Old Testament and the Hebrew, and what it's called is the Keri and Ketib. That is, you have the Aramaic of what is written, and then there's a variant that the Masoretes would have written in the text, and you said that would be what is read, and that's going to be significant for the Shiloh prophecy, as we'll observe later. But basically what it does is they preserve alternative readings where somebody might have read this instead, so they preserve these two different variants of that text where this word could be very similar, and even how I have with Psalm 22, you can see those words are very similar there, and that's another example of that we'll be going into, where the scribes were very particular and very detailed in how they transmitted and wanted to preserve the Old Testament, so they would put those variants there so people were aware of that, rather than to avoid letting any kind of corruption enter into the transmission of the Old Testament. And another thing that's important, as I refer to the Septuagint or Targum, when these books, when I say the Septuagint or Targum affirms that this prophecy is messianic, when you're witnessing to somebody who's Jewish, they can't say, well, that's just a Christian translation, because these are both Jewish translations of the Old Testament. So what they also show is an early example of Jewish interpretation of these messianic prophecies, So thinking in terms of worldview or presuppositions, they can't say, well, you're just referring to a Christian translation that's biased in favor of your view of making Christ the Messiah. When I'm referencing these, I'm showing that even early Jewish scholars who were translating these texts that were used by the Jews acknowledge that Christ is the Messiah in some of these texts that I'm pointing to. So we're engaging them on a worldview level and showing that even these Jewish sources point to Christ being the Messiah in the Old Testament. So the first text I want to address is Genesis 3:15. It's sometimes called the Proto-Evangelion, which is the first gospel. And it comes in the context of right after the fall, where Adam and Eve have sinned against God. And it comes in the midst of the curse against Satan. And in verse 15 it says, "An enmity I will place between you and between the woman, and between your seed and between her seed. He himself will crush you on the head, and you yourself will strike him on the heel." So it's talking about a seed from the woman would crush the head of Satan. And I want to read one Jewish interpretation of this passage from the JPS commentary, which is a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament by a scholar named Nahum Sarna, and he gives his interpretation of this text. He says, "This curse seeks to explain the natural revulsion of humans for the serpent. Clearly, when it entered into conversation with the woman, it could not have been so regarded. Indeed, it posed as her friend, solicitous of her interest." So he would interpret this, rather than being some sort of messianic prophecy, he would argue that it merely explains why women hate snakes. But there's a few problems with that interpretation. The first is we have to look at what does that word enmity mean, because obviously that plays a large role in the background of viewing to what extent was this enmity that's prophesied here. If we understand this word, that's going to be crucial to the discussion. And looking at that Hebrew word for enmity, it is used clearly as an example of hostility in warlike language. The New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology defines it. For example, Rasha normally designates those who, because of their wicked actions, stand under God's judgment, while Oyev, which is the word here for enmity, must often represents external enemies. Oyev is also found in antithesis with the terms such as neighbor, Rea, Ohav, friend, Erech, one's equal, aloof, companion, and Meyuda, close friend. So it's used in contrast to all these words of friendship and neighbor and things. It's obviously denotes some kind of warlike hostility in terms of enemy language. Another point is that Targum Onkelos, one of the Aramaic translations of the Old Testament, directly translate this with a word that means hostility. So the word there clearly denotes something more than just a general dislike that women have of snakes, but it clearly denotes some type of adversity, some enmity with the serpent, so it goes beyond that language. One of the second objections that you'll probably come across is that they will argue the word seed is collective here, so it refers to descendants of the woman and not a single descendant. So it can't be referring to Christ because it means more plural in terms of the descendants or her offspring. And the problem here is that technically that word for seed in Hebrew, it can mean both descendants or a single descendant. So depending on the context, it can mean either or. And Walter Kaiser has a good example of how we can understand this. He says, "However, the very fact the noun seed is a collective singular deliberately provides for the fact that it may include the one who represents the whole group as well as the group itself. The fact that there is such a one specified in this text as a male descendant of the woman opens up this text to its messianic possibilities." And we also see that later in the book of Galatians, Paul, in commenting on this passage, he says that it was referring to one seed, namely Christ. So Paul, who's obviously trained in Judaism, trained as a Pharisee, very skilled in the Old Testament, he would interpret this as a single seed referring to Christ. And that's in Galatians 3:16 that he does that. And it's also, one last observation on Genesis 3:15 is that the pronoun is he will crush the seed of the serpent, and that's very clear with the Hebrew pronoun and autos in the Greek Septuagint. The Roman Catholics will change this to she and say that this is Mary crushing the seed of the serpent, whereas there's no basis for that based on the Hebrew or the Greek. That's based on a later correction to the Latin Vulgate in order to propagate their Marian doctrines, but there's no exegetical basis for that at all. The second major prophecy, in seeing this continuity of starting with the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent, is in Genesis 49:10, where you have Jacob who's about to die, and he's prophesying about the future of the 12 tribes of Israel, about his sons. It's in Genesis 49:10 where he gives a prophecy about the tribe of Judah right before he's about to pass away, giving his patriarchal blessings on his sons and curses on some for their disobedience. And he says in Genesis 49:10, "A scepter will not depart from Judah, nor a scepter from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him belongs the obedience of the peoples." And the debate here is, what does that word Shiloh mean? And most translations will just leave it as Shiloh and not translate it. And there are basically three interpretations. One is it just refers to a place called Shiloh. And then there's two different Messianic prophecies. And I'm going to read again from a Jewish commentary where he just lists these three possibilities. He says, "The present rendering, that of Yalkut and Leka Tov, takes Shiloh as a combination of Shai, tribute, and Lo to him. Several ancient versions understand it as in late Hebrew Shiloh, that which belongs to him, that is, until he obtains the monarchy." And the second view is that Shiloh is a messianic reference. An early tradition found in the text of Qumran in the Targums and in rabbinic literature sees in Shiloh a messianic title, although no biblical passage supports this. It has even been noted the numerical value of the consonants Shiloh will come is equal to that of the Messiah. So he even points out that although he's Jewish and he denies that this is a messianic prophecy, he points to the fact that there are some early, even Jewish interpretations of this as a messianic prophecy. And in terms of Christian interpretation, there's two basic views of how to interpret this. The first is that it comes from the noun Shilon, which means rest. And in light of that, some commentators would argue that this refers to Christ as the Prince of Peace. And that's a very common interpretation. That's messianic. And another one that I side with, that's also supported by evangelical scholars, is that it refers to whom it belongs. And I have it broken up down there with the word Shiloh. And I want to briefly explain why I would side with that view versus the other one. Both of these views are Christian interpretations that see it as messianic. I'm not denying that Christ is the Prince of Peace. I just think that that's supported from other passages and not in particular this passage here in Genesis 49 verse 10. So I'm going to read Voss explain why he takes it and breaking it up into the three parts of it. He says, "I resolved the word Shiloh after leaving off the vowels into the three characters sh, l, and o. Then sh is the abbreviated form of the relative, which means like whom or which I have there on the board. You have the l for lamed, which is to or towards, and it's something that denotes possession. And the o, which I have there with the line with the dot on top, as you can see on the board, that just means him. So taken at the end of the word is a suffix, third masculine singular, bearing the possessive sense of his. Taken cumulatively, this yields the rendering he to whom it belongs. So that's how I would interpret it, breaking up the three parts of the word, that it would be he to whom it belongs in terms of the scepter belonging to the Messiah as a direct reference there. And that's how I would interpret it, along with Voss, Walter Kaiser, and some other evangelical Old Testament theologians. And a parallel passage that they cite in support of this is in Ezekiel 21:27, which uses the exact same word. And Voss again says that this is not an arbitrary or prejudicial explanation, appears from the passage in Ezekiel that must evidently be accounted for as a conscious echo of the Jacob blessing. The mysterious characters of Shiloh reappear here. It is true the subject to which in each case the relative belongs differs as between Genesis and Ezekiel, but it differs only in form, not in substantial meaning. In Genesis it is a scepter and the judge's staff held by Judah, while in Ezekiel it is designated as the government. So that same word and the same basic meaning is used in Ezekiel 21:27 in the same sense that it's used here in Genesis 49:10. Another reason why I would accept that view is that basically with the scribes, they had an alternate spelling of Shiloh where they dropped off that hey, that like H letter on the end of the word. And in Hebrew, that is more like a vowel holder. It doesn't change the meaning if it drops off, but the Masoretes who did the vowel pointing, they noted a variant where it had the hey dropped off, and that's the main argument against it, where you have to change the word and drop off this. But since the Masoretes themselves, who tenaciously sought to preserve the Old Testament text, since they noted that variant without the hey, it's very clear that it's not challenging that the Old Testament's corrupted in any sense to say that since they cited that as a variant, that would be a very tenable position to take, since they noted that that was a variant listed for the text. Whereas if you take it as Prince of Peace, you have to add another consonant on the end that would end up changing the word, and it gets into a lot of more questionable things of how do you then justify changing it. A few more points in terms of why that is supported is the Septuagint, the Greek translation that's Jewish, translated as whom it belongs. So that would also support that as an early Jewish translation of the passage in Shiloh, or of Shiloh in Genesis 49:10. So basically, in terms of those two views, whether it's Prince of Peace or whether it's to whom it belongs, I think to whom it belongs has better support from the text. But even if you take the other view, these are both Messianic views, and if you're going to use one in evangelism and you disagree with me on that, then just know how to defend your position on that if you're going to use that passage when witnessing to somebody who is Jewish. And the next passage that I want to look at, or there's one actually counter argument I want to briefly address here, and that is some Jewish objections will say that, well, couldn't this just refer to King David rather than Jesus? Couldn't it just be the scepter given to King David instead? But the problem is that the dominion and the kingdom described in this text far surpasses that of anything that David achieved. An Old Testament scholar, John Sailhammer, says the use of the plural word nations rather than the singular suggests that Jacob had in view a kingship that extended beyond the boundaries of the Israelites to include other nations as well. There may be an anticipation of this view in the promise of God to Jacob in Genesis 28:3 and 48:4, I will make you a community of peoples. In any case, later biblical writers were apparently guided by texts such as this in formulating their view of the universal reign of the future Davidic king, such as Psalm 2. So basically, in terms of the context of that passage, it has a kingdom that's far larger scope than anything David ever ruled over. So to say that this just refers to King David is ruled out by the context of the passage. And one last passage I want to view, and just looking at this progression from that seed of the woman, Genesis 3:15, to the Shiloh, and then a very similar prophecy is in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verses 17 to 19. And this is a prophecy that's given by Balaam, who's actually a false prophet, and he was commanded by King Balak of Moab, where Israel is passing through the land, and he commissions him to curse Israel because they're an enemy of Moab. So he commissions him to do that. And in spite of that, God in his sovereignty he turns around that which was intended for a curse and uses it as a blessing in a messianic prophecy on the nation of Israel. And it says in verse 17, I translate it from the Hebrew, it says, I see him, but not now. I see him, but he is not near. A star will come from Jacob, a scepter will rise from Israel, and he will smash the corners of Moab, and he will tear down all the sons of Seth. So you have this star and a scepter, and even thinking back to the verse we just addressed, that scepter alludes back to Genesis 49 and that Shiloh prophecy about the staff and the scepter to whom it belongs. So it's building on that prophecy we see here in terms of understanding the progress of this promise of the Messiah in the Old Testament. And I want to give two basic interpretations, again citing a Jewish scholar where he gives two basic views of how this star and staff are interpreted here in this verse. He says, some commentators have taken their cue from Kokva, star, and sought a parallel meaning for Shebet, citing Aramaic Shebit, the name of a star referencing to a meteor or shooting star that leaves a tail in its wake, having the appearance of a staff or scepter, extending the usual meaning of Hebrew Shebet. Alternatively, one could take a cue from Shebet in its figurative connotation of sovereign or head, namely one who bears a scepter. Thus, Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the magistrate from the issue of his loins. So even he acknowledges that it is a legitimate moved to say that this is alluding back to Genesis 49:10 and what Moses wrote there. And again, the problem is, if you were to say with this prophecy, if somebody that was Jewish will say, well, this is just another reference to David, nothing more than that. The problem is that, again, David's kingdom never was this big that extended outside of the boundaries of just a small nation of Israel. So it can't account for, in terms of the dominion prophesied in Psalm 2 and other places in the Old Testament of the kingdom of the Messiah. It doesn't fit with describing David's kingdom because it wasn't that big ever at any point in the Old Testament. And even in looking at some of the translations of the other Jewish translations of this passage, which translate it in that word shebet for scepter, they translate it in the Septuagint as anthropos, so they view it not just as a scepter, but as a man, as a person. And even in the Targum Onkelos, the Jewish translation, it explicitly uses the word the Messiah in Aramaic. So they have attestation in their early Jewish translations that clearly view this passage as messianic. And in terms of one of the common counter-arguments that people will make is say, well, the problem with that is if you're trying to make a connection between Genesis 3:15 and the word for crushing the head of the serpent, there's a different Hebrew word that occurs here, and therefore it can't be referring to the same thing. But the problem with that is concepts aren't limited to just one single word conveying a concept. They can have a range of meaning, and you can have similar words convey that same meaning. So if you look at similar passages and how it's used, then that can inform that. And when you do, it shows that it is actually connected to Genesis 3:15. And James Hamilton, a professor from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, has a good article where he traces this word used in Genesis 3:15 and shows how it connects to this prophecy here in Numbers. And he basically traces this Hebrew word that's used in that passage in Genesis 3:15 and looks at all the passages where it's used and shows how it's similar. He shows how the word that's used in Genesis 3:15 is used also in Judges 5:26 to describe Jael crushing Sisera's head. It's used in Habakkuk 3:13 to describe the salvation coming by the Messiah who crushed the head of the house of the wicked. It's used also in Psalm 68:22, where Yahweh is described as triumphing over his enemies and crushing their heads. And in Psalm 110, verse 6, it says he shattered the head over a broad country. So this concept of crushing the head of the evil one is not something that's just taken out of Genesis 3:15. There are a lot more Old Testament passages that develop this theme so that it isn't something that a Jewish person could say, well, you're just reading in your Christian theology back into the Old Testament. But we can actually see this development in the Old Testament itself as the writers, the later prophets, would have been thinking about and further developing what Moses wrote back in Genesis 3:15. And another difference that we have to observe in terms of seeing this prophecy in Numbers 24 versus Genesis 49:10 is obviously the context of the passage. Whereas in Genesis 49, Jacob is addressing the 12 tribes of Israel, whereas here in Numbers, it's talking about Israel as a whole. And that's because, I would argue, as other scholars have noted, like Gerhardus Voss, that it has the Abrahamic covenant in view, where it says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in light of that, God ironically turning the tables where Balaam wanted to curse Israel, and he turns it into a blessing on them. It's very clear why it's viewing Israel nationally rather than as separate tribes and just focusing on Judah. So that doesn't deny that these are connected prophecies. Voss says, explains this with a few basic reasons. It connects the Messiah with Jacob, Israel, not with Judah. Subjection of the nations is described more concretely and at the same time in a more limited way. In Genesis 49, there is voluntary submission. Here, obedience is compulsory. by conquest of arms. The Shiloh prophecy is climatic. This is programmatic, a successive unfolding of history. So even though there are some differences, if we're comparing Genesis 49 with this prophecy in Numbers 24, we can still see the similar themes and concepts and ideas that develop between the passages, and understanding how they develop to give a wider picture of the Messianic prophecy pointing to Christ as a ruling king in terms of his kingship and his office. Messianic prophecy in the Old Testament, starting with Genesis 3:15, as each Messianic prophecy cumulatively builds and expands upon previous ones, providing stronger evidence for the Messiah than viewing each Messianic prophecy in isolation. As is the case with Numbers 24:17, it demonstrates there is much stronger evidence for this prophecy as messianic when viewed in light of previous prophecies such as Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 49:10, along with other Old Testament passages building on similar motifs or themes of the Messiah, which demonstrate these passages refer to a larger scope than King David being fulfilled in the person of Christ, the skull-crushing seed of the woman, Shiloh, he to whom the scepter of the tribe of Judah belongs, and the star and the scepter who has dominion over all nations. So that was my brief introduction to my first lesson, and just giving some of the key terms and some of the definitions. And then the second part is going to be focusing just on three key passages that are important for evangelism. Deuteronomy 18, Psalm 22, and Isaiah 53 are the three that I want to focus on now. And actually with Deuteronomy 18, I want to quote from a Muslim apologist because, as you may know, depending on how much you've looked at Islam or witnessed to Muslims, they would argue that some of these messianic prophecies, rather than referring to Christ, they would say they refer to Muhammad instead. So I'm going to read from Ahmed Didat, who we saw some of his videos in the last lesson, explain how he argues that Deuteronomy 18 actually refers to Muhammad rather than Christ, according to his view. He says that prophet in Deuteronomy 18, if we look up any Bible which has a concordance or cross-references, that we will find in the marginal note where the words the prophet or that prophet occur in John 1 verse 25, that these words refer to the prophecy of Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 and 18. And that prophet, the prophet like Moses, like unto thee, we have proved through overwhelming evidence that he was Muhammad and not Jesus. We Muslims are not denying that Jesus was the Messiah, which word is translated as Christ. We're not contesting the 1,001 prophecies which the Christians claim abound in the Old Testament foretelling the coming of the Messiah. What we say is that Deuteronomy 18:18 does not refer to Jesus Christ, but is an explicit prophecy about the holy prophet Muhammad. And further explanation of why he takes that view, when he looks at the questions of the Jews to John the Baptist, and based on their distinction of the question between are you the prophet, are you the Messiah, he makes a distinction on that basis of how the Jews ask him that, oh, therefore the prophet and the Messiah are two different people. He says, we Muslims are really interested in the last question posed to John the Baptist by the Jewish elite in John chapter 1 verse 21. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. John 1:21. Three questions. Please note that three different and distinct persons were posed to John the Baptist, in which he gave three emphatic no's as answers. To recapitulate, art thou the Christ? Art thou Elias? Art thou the prophet? But the learned men of Christendom somehow only see two questions implied here. To make doubly clear that the Jews definitely had three separate prophecies in their minds when they were interrogating John the Baptist, let us read the remonstrance of the Jews in the verses following. And they asked him and said unto him, why baptizest thou then, if thou be not the Christ, nor Elias, neither that prophet? In John chapter 1 verse 25. The Jews were awaiting for the fulfillment of three distinct prophecies: one, the coming of Christ; two, the coming of Elias; and three, the coming of that prophet. And the problem with that, obviously, is when he's making that objection, he's ignoring the cumulative testimony of the Old Testament, which views Christ as prophet, priest, and king, and not taking into account how the Old Testament develops those offices and how they're fulfilled in the person of Christ. whereas a Muslim views that in a very limited sense, and it makes sense that Muhammad would view that because Muhammad, as we addressed last time, he didn't have the Bible with him. He was ignorant of the Bible in the previous revelation. He didn't have that, so it would make sense why these Muslim apologists who haven't read the Bible would try to have to twist the Bible to interpret Muhammad as being prophesied in the Old Testament, because if Muhammad isn't prophesied in the Old Testament, the Quran is false and Islam is false. So they're dependent on some way to try to find some passages to force Muhammad into them. And if you're interested in that more specifically, you can check out James White's book, What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran. And in chapter 9 of that book, he goes through all of the prophecies that Muslims use as arguments for Muhammad being prophesied in the Old Testament. I was just giving this example here, so I'm not going to go through all of their other passages, but just to give you an example of how Messianic theology and looking at these can equally apply to witnessing to Muslims, so I wanted to give that example. And obviously also because Muslims believe that they would say that we are consistent with the previous revelation from Allah. They would say we believe in the Old and New Testament. So in terms of the Messianic prophecies, they can't consistently argue that the Old and New Testament are corrupted. So they can't just say, well, the reason Muhammad's there is because it's corrupted, because as we addressed in our last lesson, the Quran explicitly commands Christians to judge by what Allah has revealed in the previous scriptures in the Old and New Testament. So what they have to do is force Muhammad into some passages while they can't at the same time say that they're corrupted. And in terms of Deuteronomy 18, which is the first of the three I want to address, you have Moses addressing Israel corporately. He's giving commands to the people of Israel, such as not using divination or magic, giving them God's law as the perfect standard of righteousness. And then in verse 15 of chapter 18, it says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to me." And in terms of that verse, there's a few qualifications we see for this prophet. The first is he's from your countrymen, which means he's from the 12 tribes of Israel. So therefore, from the start, Muhammad can't be this prophet because he came from Ishmael, not Isaac. He was not from the 12 tribes of Israel, so he can't qualify as the prophet that is from the countrymen of Moses, because he did not descend from the 12 tribes of Israel, but rather was from Ishmael and not Isaac, from the seed of promise. The second is that he must be a prophet like Moses. And the third is based on the following verses that it talks about that this prophet must teach in continuity with God's revelation, which again would exclude Muhammad because he contradicts everything that the Old and New Testament says. He contradicts the Old Testament teaching of the need for an atonement, of the holiness of God, and of many things, even laying aside the doctrine of the Trinity, which we'll be addressing in the future weeks, is that Muhammad had no concept of the holiness of God that Isaiah taught in Isaiah 6. He had no concept of the justice of God demanding an atonement for sins, which is clearly taught throughout the Old Testament, as we'll see in Isaiah 53 very clearly. So Muhammad can't really be claimed to be the one prophesied here because he fails the standards given for a prophet. And I'm going to briefly read a comment from Henry Ainsworth, a Puritan commentator, explaining why this prophecy refers to Christ. He says, "Unto all the former diviners, wizards, charmers raised up to the heathen of the devil, Moses here poseth one prophet to be raised up unto Israel of God. And this was Christ, raised up unto the Jews, as Peter applied it, saying, Moses said unto the fathers, A prophet will the Lord your God raise up unto you. Ye are the children of the prophets and of the covenant. Unto you first God has, having raised up his son Jesus, sent him to bless you, and turning away every one of you from his iniquities." And that's in Acts chapter 3, where Peter is preaching, and he clearly applies this passage in Deuteronomy 18 to the person of Christ. And then in terms of the qualifications of "from the brethren" and "like unto me," Ainsworth further adds, in looking at those qualifications, Christ was to be a man and of the stock of the Jews by promise, because the people could not endure to hear the voice of God. Verse 16, "And as in respect of his prophecy, so the priesthood for every high priest is taken from among men." Hebrews 5:1, "And his kingdom, as in Deuteronomy 17:15, from among thy brethren shalt thou set a king over thee." And then in terms of the qualification that he was like Moses, it said, Ainsworth comments, it is said, there arose not a prophet in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, and all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do. So that's an important qualification. If we think about where Moses asked God, show me your glory, and how he knew God face to face, that was a very distinct thing that no other Old Testament prophet saw until we have a very similar and even greater event in the New Testament with the transfiguration of Christ. And Ainsworth says, this therefore cannot be understood of the ordinary prophets which were raised up in Israel, but of Christ only, as the apostle expounds it in Acts 3. And Christ was like unto Moses in respect of his office of mediation between God and his people, but greater than Moses, as being the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises, referring to Hebrews chapter 8. Like him in excellency, for as Moses excelled all the prophets in speaking with God mouth to mouth, so Christ excelled him and all men, in that being in the bosom of the Father, he hath come down from heaven and declared God unto us. Like him in faithfulness, but therein also excelling, for Moses was faithful in God's house as a servant, but Christ as a son over his own house. So in all these characteristics, if we're comparing the person of Moses to Christ, Christ is the only one who exceeds all those parallels if we parallel the ministry of Moses to Christ and looking at the different types and shadows that look forward from Moses to this prophet and have their greater fulfillment in the person of Christ. And I also want to look at Martin Luther, his commentary on Deuteronomy, and some of you may not know, but that Martin Luther was actually, by his training, an Old Testament theologian. So he was a very skilled Old Testament scholar, and I want to quote from him, and also giving another reason of why this refers to Christ as the prophet prophesied here. He says, but there cannot be another word beyond the word of Moses unless it is the gospel, since everything that belongs to the teachings of the law has been transmitted most perfectly and amply by Moses, so that nothing further can be added. For what could be added to the Decalogue, to say nothing of the rest? What loftier thing can be taught than to believe, trust, love, and fear God with one's whole heart, not to tempt God? Furthermore, what rules can be more justly and holy than those which Moses ordains concerning the external worship of God, government, and love for one's neighbor? Therefore, the Jews have no cause here to gabble that this prophet will be one who interprets Moses. Moses interprets himself in his book so well that there is no need of another, nor can another add one jot or tittle to make him clearer or more perfect. Since therefore there can not be another word beyond the perfect teaching of the law unless it were the word of grace, it follows that this prophet will not be a teacher of the law, but a minister of grace. Thus, this text clearly forces the Jews to expect from this prophet something other than what they have in Moses. And what he's pointing on is something crucial there. If you look at the Old Testament, you look at Isaiah and some of the older prophets, they're not really making anything new in terms of their contribution to their building on what Moses has said in the Pentateuch. They're building on that theology, whereas you see something very distinct in the promise of the new covenant in Christ's ministry of being the one who inaugurates the new covenant, in contrast to the covenant of works, the Mosaic covenant, which could not offer salvation, which only condemned us and pointed us to our need of Christ. And there's a key point there that Martin Luther is making. Another point is just seeing in a broader scope of Christ is the antitype of Moses, which means he's a greater Moses. Just as in Romans 5 we have Adam the first man, Christ the second man. So Adam is a type of Christ, but Christ obviously exceeds Adam as being a greater fulfillment. In the same way, Moses, as a prophet of God, has a greater fulfillment in the person of Christ. Another Old Testament theologian, Meredith Kline, expounds on this. But because of the typological nature of Israel's theocratic officers, that is, prophet, priest, and king, they point beyond themselves to their messianic antitype. Here the constitution provision of Deuteronomy 18 for the succession of Old Testament prophets is also a promise of the ultimate individual prophet of the new covenant. Agreeably, Peter affirmed that Jesus was the prophet like unto Moses, Acts 3. The apostle had grasped the significance of the event of Jesus' transfiguration, recognizing it as a counterpart to the Moses' experience under the overshadowing glory cloud at Sinai. In the command of the voice from heaven, hear him, Peter perceived the ultimate application of the Deuteronomic requirement of Israel to obey God's prophet in Deuteronomy 18:18. That was God's own identification of Jesus as the prophet, like unto Moses. The pattern set by Moses was fully matched, and of course more than matched in Jesus. For like Moses, Jesus is a prophet mediator of the covenant, not only in the sense of performing the function of authoritative spokesman in the ongoing covenantal administration, but he was also mediator of the covenant in its inauguration. So if you compare these elements of it and looking at, for example, the transfiguration versus that moment in Deuteronomy 32 where Moses, or in Exodus 32 where Moses asked God to show him his glory, and he shows that to him, we see an even greater manifestation of not just God showing that glory to Moses, but Christ showing his own glory to the disciples in the Mount of Transfiguration. So we see a far greater fulfillment in the person of Christ than we ever saw in Moses as a prophet of God. The next prophecy I want to look at is in Psalm 22, and specifically looking at this prophecy, which is very important for and looking at the death of Christ. And in particular importance, before jumping in, I want to briefly address, in terms of modern Judaism, there's two basic views of the Messiah in terms of a suffering and reigning Messiah. And this is part of the problem that there might be a difficulty in witnessing to Jews, because they have this concept of Messiah ben Joseph, Messiah son of Joseph, where they would say that that would be the suffering Messiah, and they have this concept of the Messiah, son of David. So they would say Messiah, son of Joseph, he's a suffering Messiah, and Messiah, son of David is a ruling and reigning. So they disconnect these two ideas. Whereas Christians, we look at the New Testament, we connect the ideas of suffering and glory of the Messiah as completed in one person. Whereas somebody that's Jewish looking at that is going to say, well, those are two different Messiahs, they're not the same person. So that's one of the problems that we address when we're looking at a text like Psalm 22 or Isaiah 53. And I want to briefly look at some New Testament passages that just talk about how they're connected together. The first is in Luke 24:26 on the Emmaus Road. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, "Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" So you have the role of first the sufferings of Christ, and then after that the entering into his glory. And he's talking in the context of his disciples. He's talking to them, asking them what's happened, and they're talking about, we thought this was going to be the Messiah, but he died. He didn't bring in the kingdom of God. But what Christ is pointing out is even the Old Testament itself didn't just talk about a triumphant Messiah, but it talked about his sufferings as well. And we have to understand the order of the sufferings that come first, and then him entering into glory, if we're going to have a holistic concept of the Messiah in the Old Testament. Another key passage is in the book of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 11. And Peter is talking about the salvation and the prophecies of the Old Testament prophets, and I'll read a few verses preceding. And starting in verse 9, "Obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. As to this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful searches and inquiries, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow." So here, Peter, as a Jew, likewise comes to the similar conclusion that Jesus had explained to us in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, where he sees the prophets predicting not only a glorious Messiah that would rule and reign, but also the sufferings of the Messiah, and he views those as completed and fulfilled in one person, rather than disconnected in two different views, as a common Jewish view, that it's a Messiah son of Joseph is a suffering Messiah, and Messiah son of David as this ruling and reigning, but rather they're fulfilled in one person. And we'll see that in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, that both of these go together even in the Old Testament, that it isn't some novel idea that Jesus or Peter is pulling out of a hat like a rabbit out of a hat or something like that. So in Psalm 22, we have a key passage that deals with the crucifixion of Christ, particularly in verse 18, or 17, depending on the translation. And what it talks about is specifically about Christ's hands being pierced. And one of the things to observe in terms of how did Jesus cite a psalm in the New Testament when he was being crucified? He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And at that point, they didn't have Bible verses, they didn't have chapter divisions, so how would Jesus have cited a psalm referring to him? And the way they would have done it was they would have cited the first verse of a psalm. If I said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," most of you would know I'm citing from Psalm 23 because you know that verse, you know that, you're familiar with that psalm. In the same way, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" on the cross, he's citing Psalm 22. And in light of that, he's not just citing the first verse, but he has the whole of the psalm in mind as he cites that psalm on the cross and viewing it in fulfillment of his atoning death. And one of the problems here that we address is some people will argue that the Hebrew has been corrupted here because there's two different interpretations of the Hebrew word that I have on the board there. That you can either interpret this as "they pierced," which is ka'aru, or as a lion, ka'ari. And they're almost identical except for the last letter in the Hebrew word that distinguishes those two words. And what some evangelicals unfortunately have done is they would say, well, the Septuagint says they pierced him, and the Targums also say that, so the Hebrew scripture has been corrupted and we have to reinterpret it with these other translations. The problem with that view, though, is we understand that God, when he inspired the writers to write the Old Testament, it was originally written in Hebrew, not in Greek. So if we say that the Hebrew text is corrupted here, then we end up undermining the inerrancy of Scripture by doing that. And also, we don't really have to do that because even as some of the reformers knew, there was a variant here, as I mentioned earlier, with the Keri Ketiv, what is read and what is written. The Masoretes in some of the Bibles that John Calvin and some of the reformers, John Owen, were using, they noted that there was a variant reading there that had "they are pierced." So in their Hebrew Bibles, they had that textual variant there, and knowing that it was there. And it wasn't just an arbitrary thing, because now we have even stronger evidence because we found a Dead Sea Scroll which predates the time of Christ and has the reading for "they are pierced" in a Dead Sea Scroll of that psalm. So we know that this wasn't something, well, the reformers just added that to their Hebrew Bible, they were just changing it to challenge the Jews. No, because we have a Dead Sea Scroll that predates the even pointing of the text. So you can't just say, well, what if the Masoretes, since they're Jewish, they were biased, they didn't believe in Jesus as Messiah, so obviously they had to change the Hebrew text to deny it, where we don't have to take that view because even the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate the person of Christ, testify to the reading of ka'aru as "they pierced." And I briefly want to read from theologian Richard Mueller, where he's just talking about church history in terms of how this has been interpreted, this text. He says, "First, the traditional Christian reading of Psalm 22:16, 'They have pierced my hands and my feet,' rest on the reading ka'aru, pierce, and on the Septuagint, which assumes ka'aru when it rendered the Hebrew as oriaxon, where most of the extant Hebrew texts, particularly as found in the Jewish Bibles of the 16th and 17th centuries, had ka'ari, like a lion. Was this a corruption or an error in the text? The dispute between Christians and Jews over the Messianic significance of the text almost paled before the debate between Protestants and Catholics over the question of the textual purity. This, the Orthodox note, is the only place that can be alleged as a valid corruption, but even it can be explained as a simple scribal error. The Masoretes note the ka'aru variant so that the supposed error is nothing more but an explanation of katib, what is written, and kere, the marginal correction. Several writers note that the Chaldee paraphrase, that's the Targum, the Aramaic, joins both of these readings together. Thus, "They have digged or pierced my hands, and my feet as a lion is wont to dig with his teeth." So that's another point where you see that the Aramaic has both of those readings there. The Aramaic is translated from the Hebrew, so that presupposes that in order for these Aramaic translation to have both readings, that means both readings were present in the Hebrew. If it was corrupted and already lost, they couldn't have translated that into Aramaic. So it presupposes, based on the Aramaic and on the fact that the Greek Septuagint, which they're translating from the Hebrew, has that, it points to the preservation of the Hebrew text rather than the corruption of it. And even as Henry Ainsworth notes in his commentary, which he wrote in the 17th century, where he had a commentary on the Psalms, and as I showed earlier, citing him on Deuteronomy, he wrote on the Pentateuch, and he observed some of the same things that I just quoted there. He said on verse 17, the original hath a double reading, that is the Kari Katib, Ka'ari like a lion, and Ka'aru, they digged or pierced. This later the Greek followed, but the Chaldee, the Targum, and the Masorete's Bible keeps both readings. They did bite like a lion. This was fulfilled in the nailing of our Lord to the cross by his feet and hands. So if we're talking to somebody who's Jewish and they're saying, well, you have to say that it's corrupted here, because even as I'll read from you here in this Jewish Bible that's from the Jewish Publication Society in 2003, they would translate this verse as, dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones close in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. So they would say it means like lions, not they pierced. But even if you translate it like lions, the problem is it has in parentheses, they maul, because if you say like lions, my hands and feet, there's no verb in the sentence. It doesn't make sense. You have to insert some verb to make sense of the sentence, because you just have like lions, my hands and my feet. That doesn't make any sense. So you have to insert some verb, and it doesn't really solve the problem if you take that interpretation of it to try to deny the Messianic prophecy. And given that it's attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew, it's attested by both these Jewish translations, the Septuagint in Greek and the Aramaic Targums, both affirm this Messianic interpretation. It isn't something that we're trying to say the Hebrew text has been corrupted, because it has very strong support for that Messianic prophecy. And even looking down further in chapter 22, we see in verse 31 a reference to Genesis 3:15 with the seed, the offspring of the Messiah, prospering, and showing how this prophecy likewise, like the others that we've seen, builds on that theme. In Genesis 3:15 in verse 31 it says, offspring shall serve him, the Lord's fame shall be proclaimed to the generation to come. They shall tell of his beneficence to people yet to be born, for he has acted. So even in this text in Psalm 22, you have what you have is both the sufferings and glory of the Messiah, whereas the Jewish interpretation that denies that has to reconcile. Why does the psalm here have both the sufferings and glory? If that's just a Christian idea, why does the Old Testament testify to the fact of both the sufferings and glory of the Messiah in the exact same Messianic prophecy, rather than saying, well, there's just a suffering prophecy and a glory prophecy, but here we have both those concepts unified by the Psalms.
You mentioned up here a little bit also.
What? Okay. The last prophecy that I want to focus on is Isaiah 53, and some of you know this is probably one of the main prophecies that a lot of people use for witnessing to people that are Jewish, because it's very clear in terms of who the Messiah is, what his redemptive work is, his atoning death, his entering into glory, which alludes to his resurrection. So you have all of things death, burial, and resurrection clearly taught here in Isaiah 53. One of the problems, though, is what we have to understand, that in terms of the verses of our Hebrew Bible, the verses of our Bible weren't added until about the 14th century. And technically, if you're looking at this prophecy, it really starts back in chapter 52, verse 13, to get the whole scope of the Messianic prophecy, versus just starting at chapter 53, verse 1. If you look at back in 52:13, it says, behold, my servant will prosper, he will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. So you have the start of the Messianic prophecy really beginning there, rather than in 53 verse 1. And what this is it's a servant song. In the book of Isaiah, you have several songs talking about a servant of God that will fulfill various things. And you have several songs, and this is the fourth in that series of songs that you have in the book of Isaiah that have that theme tracing through the book. And what Robert Raymond does is he explains how there's basically three views of who this servant refers to, and I've written a pyramid there on the board where you have, it can refer to Israel in some cases as the bottom of the pyramid. It can sometimes refer to the remnant of faithful Israel, the elect within Israel, the Israel according to the Spirit rather than those according to the flesh. And then it can also refer to the Messiah as the servant of God. So you have to look at the context to determine which of those three is the servant referring to understand who it is, because the common Jewish interpretation of this is Isaiah 53 just refers to Israel, but as we'll see, the context precludes that interpretation because it doesn't work consistently. So basically, Robert Raymond gives these characteristics. The first is that the servant is divine with the reference to the arm of the Lord. He's portrayed in detailed features as to his human personality, so he's both human and divine, as we find in the person of Christ. He's innocent, sinless, he's a voluntary sufferer, and he's obedient, humble, and silent unto death. And in terms of the content of what he suffered, it first springs from his love for sinners, including his executioners who act in ignorance. It's ordained by God in love and fulfills the divine intention, will, and purpose, and that's in Isaiah 53:10, where it says it pleased the Lord to crush him. It deals with sin in all its aspects. It is vicarious or substitutionary atonement. It's redemptive and spiritual in nature. It ends in death, which leads to his being buried with the rich, which condition gives way to his resurrection in 53 verses 10 to 11. It leads straying people for whom he died to confession and repentance. And finally, as his redemptive work in implementing a divine plan in which suffering, humiliation, and death are central, inaugurates a fruitful and victorious life for endless ages. So you have all basically of the life of Christ encapsulated in this prophecy, from both his suffering, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and entering into glory. You have all these characteristics here clearly attesting to the person of Christ. And in terms of the one point I mentioned earlier, the arm of the Lord, in terms of that being a reference to his deity, I just want to read from one commentator, Alec Mocher, in his commentary on Isaiah. He says, "We noted at Isaiah 51:9 how the arm of the Lord is not someone, something apart from the Lord, but is the Lord himself in all his power, such as in Psalm 44 verses 3-4, where hand, arm, and light of face occur together, i.e. the Lord's personal presence and personal action. In Deuteronomy 7 verses 18 to 19, the acts of the arm were seen while the arm remained invisible, but now it is not a matter of tracing events to an invisible cause, but a matter of seeing a person, the servant, and recognizing that he is the Lord present in power." In Isaiah 51:19, the arm was called to awake. 52:6 pledged the Lord's own presence. 52:8 foresaw the Lord's visibly coming to Zion. In 52:10, that the arm had been bared in saving action. Now at last the arm has come, not simply a person behind and through whom the Lord's power is at work, nor just one signally, even uniquely upheld by the Lord's power, but the arm himself, the Lord come to save. So as we see, for example, the arm of the Lord being stretched out in Exodus against Pharaoh, that was to demonstrate God's power over Pharaoh. It's a representation, not as if God is obviously spirit. He doesn't have physical arms, so it's not talking about God physically stretching his arm out. It's a characteristic describing the omnipotence, the power of God, and here it's being used to describe the servant, which is ascribing omnipotence to the servant and therefore giving him a characteristic that only is consistent with deity and not a human servant. And also in Isaiah 52:13, the three verbs that are used there have a significant use, as E.J. Young notes in his commentary. He says the three verbs of the second half of the verse set forth the consequences of the servant's wise dealing, with the third verb noting the state of force and also modifying adverb setting forth the final point of exaltation. He will rise in that he will not remain in his condition of humiliation. He will stand out in that he raises himself, and he will be in an exalted condition, towering above all else. It is impossible to read these words without being reminded of the exaltation of Christ depicted in Philippians 2:9-11 and Acts 2 verse 33. The combination of room to exalt, nasa to lift up, and transitive referring to the same subject is found in Isaiah 33:10, but nowhere else in the prophets. The combination of these roots shows that these words are peculiar to this passage, but And he notes how some people will try to say, well, that's irregular vocabulary, so this is not Isaiah writing, it's a different author, and trying to divide up Isaiah into two books. But the problem with that is you can't rule it out on that alone, because it fits within the context of the passage and also within the context of the other servant psalms. So it's an servant song, so it's an arbitrary argument to try to say, well, this is unique vocabulary, therefore Isaiah didn't write it, because it's obviously prejudiced based on their presuppositions to deny the messianic nature of the passage. And it's interesting to note two other translations of that passage, which I mentioned, the Septuagint of Isaiah 52:13. In the last verb, it switches out the word doxazo, which we get from doxology, and it means to glorify. So it talks about the glorification of the servant there in the Greek Septuagint, a Jewish translation. And it's also very significant that in the Aramaic Targum, a Jewish translation into Aramaic of the Old Testament, when they translated Isaiah 52:13, they specifically call the servant the Messiah in Aramaic. So they specifically affirm that this is referring to the Messiah and not Israel. So there you have a clear testimony of an early Jewish translation that views this as the Messiah and not the nation of Israel as an interpretation of it. And it's interesting to point out that even an early church father named Origen, who was very well skilled at some of the textual criticism and early translations, and he made a polyglot of all these different translations of the Bible, and we still use some of his resources for Greek and Hebrew because of that. He knew about that Targum, and he used that as an argument in terms of witnessing to Jewish people. He says, when we turn to the Targum, we find that it hardly accords with this Jewish interpretation, that is, them trying to say it just refers to the nation of Israel, except to this extent that it does represent the Jewish people as being in a state of dispersion and suffering. But on the other hand, and this is the most important point, nowhere in this passage is a servant identified with the chosen race. Instead, the distinction between the two is more clearly drawn in the Targum, that's the Aramaic, than in the original Hebrew. That is to say, even if the Jews of Origen's time were rightly understood by him to have held the collective interpretation of the servant, in this particular prophecy, it is ruled out in this Targum. So he used the Targum, the Aramaic Jewish translation, when witnessing to Jews to say, even your translation acknowledges this is the Messiah, not the nation of Israel. So how are you being consistent when your ancient translations that are Jewish and not Christian attest to this being the Messiah and not just the nation of Israel being the suffering servant? And then looking at specifically the death of Christ in this passage in verses 8 through 11, I want to read those from Isaiah 53. It says, "By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and for his generation who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he would see his offspring, he would prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify many, as he will bear their iniquities." And the problem here is, if we look at verse 8 again, where he says, "For the transgressions of my people to whom the stroke was due," so the Messiah is dying for the sins of his people. So if this is Israel, how is Israel dying for Israel's own sins? It doesn't make any sense, because Israel obviously is not a sinless guilt offering that can even fulfill that standard and being in that place as a valid sacrifice. And how is Israel going to atone for Israel's own sins? It's circular, it doesn't work. And we also see clearly in verses 10 to 11 about Christ being the righteous one who will justify many. So we see the truth of justification. We see him seeing his seed and being satisfied. So we see an allusion to his resurrection after his death, that he didn't merely just die and remain in the grave, but he did indeed rise again the third day. One of the arguments that some Jewish people might object to is they'll say when he's cut off from the land of the living, that just means, that doesn't refer to his death. But the problem is the Hebrew there is very clear, as E.J. Young and some other commentators have observed. It is better to understand he was taken as referring to be taken away by death from the unjust trial. This is supported by the parallel, he was cut off out of the land of living. From the midst of his suffering, he was taken away by death. And he points out that in all, basically, the other references that is used in the Old Testament, it has the denotation of death, violent death. So it's not just some being cut off from the land or exiled, but it has the connotation of death very clearly portrayed. And as Alec Mocher, another commentator, says, cut off, gazar, is a verb with an almost unbroken record of violence. To translate he was cut down out of the land catches the meaning. Why Bray can only salvage his fancy that Isaiah 53 does not require the actual death of the suffering servant by pleading that we need not take from the land of the living out of the land literally, but its Old Testament use is unequivocal. So truly did the servant die that like all the dead he was removed from the world of the living. So he's basically saying that when it says that he's cut off, that he was taken and then cut off from the land of the living, that's building on that. Because he was taken from the land of the living, referring to his death, he was cut off out of the land. And so those are both basically parallel to each other and building on and making it very clear that this clearly refers to the death of the Messiah and not just some feigning or some swoon theory that people will try to say happened rather than Christ actually literally dying on the cross. And you also have in here not just Isaiah describing the death of Christ, but he also gives something important about what is the purpose of the death of this suffering servant. It says in verse 10, but the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If you would render him as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. And then in verse 11, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify many. So you have here that his death wasn't merely for himself, which again would contradict Israel being the servant, because it would be Israel dying to justify their own sins, but it's the servant dying to, as his soul, being an offering to justify many. So you have the truth of justification by faith, by a substitutionary atonement clearly given here by the prophet Isaiah. And again, quoting from E.J. Young, he says, the final words may be rendered, for the transgression of my people there was a stroke to him. It is God who speaks. The stroke fell not on behalf of all men, but on behalf of my people. Again, when speaking of his death, Isaiah must give the reason for that death, namely, it is substitutionary, propitiatory in character. That is, one dying in the place of others for their sin, bearing that sin. And as a last point on this passage in particular, the word that is used for justify there in Hebrew has a very specific meaning that means to declare righteous. Even in the Hebrew, it means that. And even citing Jewish Hebrew grammar I have from Joshua Blau here, who teaches Hebrew in the land of Israel, he says that this same word is declarative, meaning to declare righteous. So it's not just that you become righteous by your works or some combination. So even we have the truth of justification by faith and by the righteousness of Christ alone clearly given even in the Hebrew text here. So you can't just argue, well, maybe they're viewing it in some Jewish context of justification where they mix in their works with it. But even the Hebrew grammar affirms that this is justification, being declared righteous, not being made righteous by mixing your works with faith or some combination like the Judaizers did. In conclusion, all the passages examined, Deuteronomy 18, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, are clear messianic prophecies which are fulfilled by Christ. Also, as I demonstrated in the last lesson, there are similar themes in some of the prophecies, like the concept of the suffering and triumphant servant intertwined in Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. While I present a lot of details for these prophecies, try to keep in mind some of the key points in terms of witnessing. Obviously, we're not going to know every messianic prophecy in the Bible for witnessing, but if we know one or two, like Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22, and we know in general several points, then that helps us to have a framework when we're witnessing to somebody who's Jewish or a Muslim. So by having like one or two and having a general outline and structure of that, that helps us to be prepared for evangelism, even if we're not going to know, obviously, all the messianic prophecies out there. Also, Deuteronomy 18 has some valuable tests of a true prophet that can be applied not only to Islam, but to many cults and false religions such as Mormonism and evangelism. Because as the last characteristic was, they had to teach in continuity of what came before. So in terms of that, you could test that with a Jehovah's Witness, with a Mormon who says that they're teaching in consistency with the Bible, because that would deny Joseph Smith as a prophet of God too, just as much as Muhammad. So that passage in Deuteronomy 18 can be used with cults and other religions. If it's some religion you've never even come across and you're witnessing to, and they have some really weird doctrine and you don't know how to respond to it, it's the first time, you can go to Deuteronomy 18, you can have that as a passage and test it according to the standard of Scripture and use that as a platform to present the gospel to them as another means of not just using it as a messianic prophecy, but also as a polemic to show that they contradict Scripture and therefore their prophet in their religion, whether it's Joseph Smith, whether it's Muhammad, can't be in continuity with the Bible because it contradicts what the Bible clearly teaches.